December 3, 1942. A small apartment on Luisenstrasse in Munich. Early morning light filtered through frost-covered windows as Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann sat at a wooden desk, fountain pen in hand, staring at a blank sheet of paper. 24 years old. Former schoolteacher. 2 years of military service. The Wehrmacht uniform hung on a chair beside him, freshly pressed, the Iron Cross second class pinned to the tunic. In 6 hours he would board a train to the Eastern Front. The apartment smelled of coffee and his mother's baking from the kitchen below. She was preparing his favorite breakfast, the way she had done before his deployment to France in 1940, before the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, before everything changed. Outside Munich was waking. Trams rattled along the streets. Factory workers trudged through December cold toward their shifts. The war was everywhere and nowhere in the city, present in the absence of young men, in the ration cards and blackout curtains, in the carefully worded announcements on the radio. Hartmann had been home for 14 days of leave. 14 days to recover from what he had seen during the retreat from Stalingrad. 14 days that felt like visiting a foreign country where people still believed the words printed in newspapers, still spoke of inevitable victory, still trusted that their sons and brothers were fighting for something noble and necessary. He picked up the pen. Started to write. Dear father. Stopped. Put the pen down. Picked it up again. Put it down. The letter he wanted to write could never be sent. The truth he wanted to tell would endanger everyone who read it. So he sat in silence, watching the morning light creep across the wooden floor, knowing that some words could only exist in the mind, never on paper, never spoken aloud. This is the story of that letter. The one he would eventually write. The one he would carry for 2 years across 3 countries. The one that would never reach its destination. And the one that would reveal, decades later, what a single soldier understood about the war that consumed him. Klaus Hartmann was born in Munich on March 15, 1918, 7 months before the armistice ended the Great War. His father, Heinrich Hartmann, had served as a captain in the Imperial German Army, fought at Verdun, returned home with a permanent limp and memories he never discussed. Heinrich became a postal administrator after the war. Methodical. Disciplined. He raised his son to respect order, duty, and the German tradition of service. Klaus's childhood spanned the chaotic years of the Weimar Republic. He remembered the hyperinflation of 1923, when his mother needed a wheelbarrow full of marks to buy bread. He remembered the political violence in the streets, the communist demonstrations, the Nazi rallies. His father navigated the turbulence by maintaining strict neutrality. Politics, Heinrich said, were for politicians. Citizens should focus on work, family, and civic responsibility. Klaus excelled in school. He loved literature, history, and languages. By age 16 he could read French and Russian fluently. His teachers encouraged him to pursue university education. In 1936, Klaus enrolled at Ludwig Maximilian University to study German literature and pedagogy. He wanted to become a teacher, to shape young minds, to preserve the cultural heritage that seemed to be slipping away in the noise of the new regime. The National Socialist transformation of Germany happened gradually around him. New laws appeared. Old neighbors disappeared. Jewish classmates left the university. Klaus noticed these things but did not question them publicly. His father's teachings held firm. Politics were for politicians. Klaus focused on his studies. He graduated in 1939 with honors. Accepted a teaching position at a gymnasium in Munich. Started his career that September, the same month Germany invaded Poland. The Wehrmacht conscription notice arrived in June 1940. Klaus reported for basic training without hesitation. Duty was duty. His father had served. Now it was his turn. The training was rigorous but not brutal. The instructors emphasized discipline, tactical proficiency, and the importance of the soldier's role in national defense. Klaus proved capable with a rifle. He learned to read maps, dig trenches, march 20 kilometers with full equipment. In September 1940, he completed training and received assignment to Infantry Regiment 197, stationed in occupied France. France was Klaus's first experience of conquered territory. His regiment was deployed near Dijon, responsible for maintaining order in the countryside. The work was administrative more than military. Checking papers. Inspecting farms for contraband weapons. Ensuring compliance with German regulations. Klaus found the duty unsettling in its mundaneness. The French farmers he encountered were neither hostile nor welcoming. They simply endured, did what was required, and waited for the war to end. He wrote letters home describing the French countryside, the architecture of small villages, the quality of the wine requisitioned for officers. He did not write about the subtle resentment in civilian eyes, the way conversations stopped when German soldiers entered cafes, the graffiti that appeared overnight on walls. These were observations without clear meaning. Not dramatic enough to report. Not harmless enough to ignore. Just the texture of occupation. In April 1941, Klaus received 2 weeks of leave. He returned to Munich. His father asked few questions about France. His mother worried about his weight. His former students at the gymnasium wanted to hear stories of adventure. Klaus told them about the French cathedrals, the different varieties of cheese, the difficulty of speaking French with a Bavarian accent. He made the war sound like tourism with uniforms. The reassignment orders came in May. Infantry Regiment 197 was being transferred east. Destination classified. Klaus and his comrades knew what east meant. Operation Barbarossa was no longer a secret, though officially it did not yet exist. The regiment traveled by train through Poland into occupied Soviet territory. Klaus watched the landscape change outside the windows. The neat German farms gave way to the sprawling fields of Poland, then to the vast, flat expanse of Western Russia. The train stopped at small stations where local populations watched with expressions that mixed fear and calculation. On June 22, 1941, at 0315 hours, Klaus experienced combat for the first time. His regiment crossed the border as part of Army Group Center's advance toward Minsk. The initial days were chaos. Artillery barrages that shook the ground. Aircraft overhead in endless formations. Columns of Soviet prisoners trudging west, tens of thousands of them, faces empty of expression. Klaus's company advanced rapidly. Soviet resistance was disorganized. Entire units surrendered without fighting. Others fought with desperate ferocity and were annihilated. Klaus shot his first man on June 25. A Soviet soldier, young, maybe 18, emerged from a destroyed bunker with his hands raised. Klaus and two other Germans approached to take him prisoner. The Soviet dropped his hands suddenly, reaching for something in his tunic. Klaus fired instinctively. 3 shots. Center mass. The Soviet fell. When they checked the body, they found a photograph in his hand. Not a weapon. Just a photograph of a woman and a child. The incident was not reported. Nothing to report. A Soviet soldier was dead. That was the point of being here. Klaus's sergeant clapped him on the shoulder. Said he had done well. Said hesitation gets you killed. Klaus nodded. Did not speak. That night, in a temporary bivouac near Minsk, he tried to write a letter home. Started with Dear Father. Stopped. Put the pen away. There were no words for what he felt. The advance continued through July and August. The Wehrmacht achieved victory after victory. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops encircled and captured. Cities fell. The German generals spoke of ending the campaign before winter. Klaus's regiment participated in the Battle of Smolensk. The fighting was brutal. Soviet forces counterattacked repeatedly. German casualties mounted. But the Wehrmacht prevailed. Always prevailed. By September, Klaus had been in combat for 3 months. He had learned to dig foxholes quickly, to recognize the sound of different artillery calibers, to sleep in any position during brief pauses. He had also learned that war was not glorious or heroic. It was exhausting, terrifying work punctuated by moments of violence so sudden they seemed unreal. In October, the autumn rains began. The roads turned to mud. The advance slowed. Vehicles bogged down. Horses died from exhaustion. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers. Klaus's company spent weeks trapped in mud that sucked boots off feet, that made every step an ordeal. The cold started in November. Not gradual autumn chill but sudden vicious cold that turned mud into iron and made rifles malfunction. Klaus's regiment received winter clothing in December. Too little too late. Frostbite casualties outnumbered combat casualties. The offensive toward Moscow stalled 30 kilometers from the city. Soviet counterattacks pushed the Wehrmacht back. For the first time, Klaus's regiment retreated. The withdrawal was organized but grim. They abandoned equipment. Left wounded behind. The cold killed as efficiently as Soviet bullets. Klaus witnessed men freeze to death in their foxholes, found sitting upright with rifles in their hands, eyes open, completely still. The winter retreat revealed cracks in the narrative Klaus had accepted. The Wehrmacht was not invincible. The Soviets were not the disorganized rabble described in propaganda. This war would not end quickly. Klaus survived the winter of 1941-42 through luck more than skill. His company lost 60% of its men to combat, frostbite, and disease. He spent January and February in defensive positions west of Moscow, enduring temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The regiment rotated to rear areas in March. Klaus received promotion to Obergefreiter for his service. The Iron Cross second class was awarded in April. He accepted it without pride or shame. It was a piece of metal. It changed nothing. The summer offensive of 1942 began in June. Klaus's regiment was assigned to Army Group South, advancing toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The operation started well. The Wehrmacht achieved breakthrough after breakthrough. Soviet forces retreated. The weather was perfect, hot and dry, nothing like the previous winter. Confidence returned to the ranks. Perhaps the generals had been right. Perhaps one more push would break Soviet resistance. Klaus's regiment reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in late August. The city stretched along the western bank of the Volga River, a sprawling industrial center of factories and worker housing. The plan was to capture it quickly, then continue south. The battle started on September 13th. It did not end quickly. The Soviets defended every building, Every floor, every room. German advances were measured in meters. Klaus's company fought for 3 days to capture a single apartment block. When they finally secured it, 18 men remained from the original 95. The fighting in Stalingrad was unlike anything Klaus had experienced. France had been police work. The initial invasion of the Soviet Union had been mobile warfare. Stalingrad was industrial slaughter. Combat at arm's length. Grenades thrown into rooms. Bayonets and knives. The city was rubble, but the rubble provided cover for defenders. Soviet snipers killed from positions and destroyed buildings. Artillery reduced entire neighborhoods to dust. Mortars rained down constantly. The smell was overwhelming. Smoke, cordite, sewage, rotting flesh. Klaus killed regularly in Stalingrad. He stopped counting after 20. He fired his rifle at shapes moving in rubble. Threw grenades into basements. Stabbed a Soviet soldier during hand-to-hand fighting in a factory workshop. These acts became mechanical. There was no time for reflection, no space for doubt. Each day was survival until nightfall. Each night was terror until dawn. In October, Klaus witnessed his first execution of civilians. His company occupied a district near the tractor factory. The officers ordered a sweep for Soviet infiltrators. 37 civilians were found in a cellar, men, women, and children. The officers questioned them. None spoke German. No one could verify their identities or intentions. The lieutenant commanding the company called Klaus forward. Klaus spoke Russian. Asked them if they are partisans. Klaus translated. The civilians denied it. Old men, mothers, children. They were factory workers and their families hiding from the bombing. They had no weapons. They wanted only to survive. The lieutenant considered this. Then ordered Klaus to ask if any of them had provided information to Soviet forces. The answer was the same. They had seen Soviet soldiers but had not helped them. They had done nothing. They were innocent. The lieutenant nodded. Said, "We cannot verify their claims. We cannot leave potential threats behind our lines. You know the orders." Klaus knew the orders. Partisan activity was to be suppressed with extreme prejudice. Anyone suspected of aiding the enemy was subject to immediate execution. But these were not partisans. They were civilians hiding in a cellar. The lieutenant looked at Klaus. "Tell them they must come with us for interrogation." Klaus translated. The civilians stood. Started moving toward the exit. The lieutenant gestured to 3 soldiers with machine pistols. The shooting began before Klaus understood what was happening. The civilians fell in groups, cut down in seconds. The children died holding their mother's hands. Klaus stood frozen. The lieutenant walked past him. Said, "War is not clean, Hartmann. The sooner you accept that, the easier it becomes." That night, Klaus tried to sleep in a destroyed factory building. He could not close his eyes without seeing the children. Could not silence the memory of their screams. He took out paper and his fountain pen. Started to write. "Dear father, I need to tell you what I have seen." He stopped. Looked at the words. Realized the impossibility of continuing. The truth would endanger his family. Letters were censored. If he described what was happening in Stalingrad, if he questioned the orders, he would be court-martialed. His family would be investigated. His father's position would be at risk. He tore up the paper. But the need to write remained, growing stronger, more insistent. Words accumulated in his mind with nowhere to go. Observations. Doubts. Questions about what they were doing here, about whether the cause they served was just, about whether any of this could be justified. In November, Soviet forces launched their counteroffensive. They encircled Stalingrad, trapping the German 6th Army and Klaus's regiment inside the city. The pocket formed within days. Suddenly, Klaus's company was cut off from supply lines, surrounded by Soviet forces that grew stronger while German forces weakened. The Luftwaffe promised airlift operations to supply the trapped troops. The supplies never arrived in sufficient quantity. Rations were cut to quarter portions. Ammunition was rationed. Medical supplies ran out. Klaus spent November and early December in a state of slow starvation and constant combat. His company held positions in the factory district. Soviet attacks came daily. German strength declined. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical care. Others died from typhus and dysentery. Frostbite returned as winter arrived. The temperature dropped. Clothing worn through. No replacements available. On December 19, Klaus received 2 weeks emergency leave. The Luftwaffe was evacuating wounded and essential personnel. Klaus was neither, but his company commander falsified documents, claiming Klaus was needed for language liaison duties at higher headquarters. The real reason was compassion. The commander knew Klaus would die if he stayed. On December 20, Klaus boarded a Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft. It flew out of Stalingrad as Soviet artillery fire traced arcs across the morning sky. He arrived in Munich on December 21. His family did not know he was coming. He appeared at the apartment door in a uniform that hung loose on his frame. He had lost 15 kilograms. His mother cried when she saw him. His father said nothing, just embraced him with the awkward formality of men who do not know how to show emotion. The 14 days of leave passed in a strange disconnection. Klaus walked through Munich seeing a city that seemed unchanged. People went to work. Shops opened and closed. The war was discussed in abstract terms, strategic maps in newspapers, victory proclamations on the radio. No one spoke about what Klaus had seen. No one asked the right questions. When they asked about the war, they wanted reassurance. They wanted to be told that Germany was winning, that sacrifice was necessary and temporary, that everything would be fine. Klaus could not give them that reassurance. He could not tell them the truth either. So he spoke in generalities. Talked about the weather on the Eastern Front. Described Russian architecture. Made observations that sounded like answers without containing any real information. On December 3rd, his last full day at home, Klaus woke early. He went to his desk in the small room where he had studied as a boy. He took out his fountain pen and paper. He had decided during the night that he needed to write the letter. Not to send it. Just to write it. To put the words somewhere outside his mind. To create a record of what he knew, what he had seen, what he understood about the war. He started writing at 0630. By 0900 he had filled 8 pages. The words came easily once he allowed them to flow. He wrote about France and the quiet resentment of occupation. He wrote about the invasion of the Soviet Union and the initial victories that felt hollow. He wrote about Stalingrad, about the civilians in the cellar, about the orders he had followed and the men he had killed. He wrote about the propaganda and the reality, about the gap between what people believed at home and what soldiers knew at the front. He wrote about the certainty he felt that Germany would lose this war, that the cost would be catastrophic, that everything they had been told about the nobility of their cause was a lie built on earlier lies. He wrote, "Dear Father, I know you served in the Great War. I know you returned with wounds and memories you never shared. I understand now why you never spoke of it. War cannot be explained to those who have not seen it. And to those who have seen it, explanation is unnecessary. But I need to tell you something that I cannot tell you in person. We are not the righteous defenders that the newspapers claim. We are not saving civilization from barbarism. We are the barbarism." He wrote about the executions, the casual cruelty, the systematic violence against civilians. He wrote about German soldiers looting homes, burning villages, killing anyone suspected of resistance or simply anyone who was inconvenient. He wrote about the orders from above that made these actions official policy, that turned individual cruelty into organized campaigns of terror. He wrote, "I have followed orders that I knew were wrong. I told myself I had no choice. I told myself that refusal would mean my own death, would accomplish nothing except adding my name to the list of the executed. I told myself these things because accepting the alternative, accepting that I chose to obey rather than choosing to resist, was unbearable. But it is the truth. I chose. We all chose. Every German soldier who follows criminal orders is choosing. We are complicit." He wrote about the men in his company, good men by any reasonable measure, who committed acts of violence that would horrify them if described in any other context. He wrote about how easily normal people adapt to abnormal circumstances, how quickly the unthinkable becomes routine. He wrote about the lies. The propaganda claims of Soviet atrocities that were used to justify German atrocities. The promises that the war would end soon. The insistence that Germany was fighting a defensive war when the Wehrmacht was thousands of kilometers into Soviet territory. The racial theories that dehumanized the enemy and made mass killing acceptable. "Father, I have come to believe that everything we were told about this war is false. We are not fighting to defend our homeland. We invaded other countries. We are not fighting to protect German people from aggression. We are the aggressors. And the cause we serve, the ideology that justifies this war, is fundamentally evil." The word evil sat on the page like an accusation. Klaus stared at it. He had never used that word before in describing the war. Difficult, brutal, tragic, these were words he had used. But evil implied moral judgment. It implied that there was a right and wrong and that Germany was wrong. It implied that everything he had done, everyone he had killed, every order he had followed, was participation in something morally indefensible. He continued writing. He described the soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, his friends and comrades who would die because the leadership refused to authorize retreat. He described the certainty he felt that the war was lost, that the only question was how long Germany would continue fighting and how many more people would die before accepting inevitable defeat. He wrote about the future he imagined, the defeat that was coming, the occupation of Germany, the trials that would follow. He wrote about justice and accountability, about whether saying "I was following orders" would be accepted as a defense. He suspected it would not be. He hoped it would not be. Because if following orders was sufficient justification for what he had done, then morality meant nothing. The letter reached 12 pages. When Klaus finished, he read it through from beginning to end. It was the most honest thing he had ever written. Every word was true. Every observation was accurate. Every conclusion followed from the evidence. The letter was also a death sentence for anyone who read it. Possession of such a document would be considered treason. It questioned the war, criticized the leadership, used the word evil to describe German actions. Anyone found with this letter would be executed. Klaus folded the pages carefully. He placed them in an envelope. He wrote on the envelope, "To my father, Heinrich Hartmann, to be opened only after my death." Then he sealed it. He tucked the envelope into the inner pocket of his uniform tunic, the pocket over his heart. He would carry it with him when he returned to the front. Not to send it. Never to send it. Just to carry it. A record. A testimony. A confession. At 1,500 hours, Klaus said goodbye to his parents. His mother cried. His father shook his hand and told him to do his duty. Klaus boarded the train to the Eastern Front carrying the letter he would never send. He never returned to Stalingrad. The 6th Army surrendered on February 2, 1943. Klaus's entire company was killed or captured. If he had stayed, he would have died with them or spent years in Soviet captivity. Instead, he was reassigned to Army Group Center, deployed to Belarus, tasked with anti-partisan operations. The partisan war was different from conventional combat. No front lines. No clearly defined enemy. The partisans struck supply convoys, sabotaged railway lines, assassinated German officials. The German response was collective punishment. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were burned. Civilians suspected of providing information were hanged. The ratio was official. For every German killed by partisans, 10 civilians would be executed. Klaus participated in these operations. He had no choice, or so he told himself. Refusal meant court-martial and execution. Compliance meant becoming what he had written about in the letter, a participant in evil. He chose compliance and hated himself for it. In March 1943, Klaus's unit surrounded a village suspected of partisan activity. The villagers were assembled in the central square. The officer in command demanded information about partisan movements. No one spoke. The officer selected 10 men at random. Ordered them shot as an example. Klaus stood in formation as the executions took place. He watched old men die for crimes they had not committed. He did nothing to stop it. That night he took out the letter. Read it by candlelight in a barn where his unit was bivouacked. The words he had written in December seemed prophetic. He had become exactly what he had feared becoming. Complicit. A participant in systematic violence against innocent people. He added a new page to the letter. I wrote previously that we are complicit. I did not understand then how complete that complicity would become. There is no longer any distinction between following orders and choosing to commit crimes. The orders themselves are crimes. To follow them is to become a criminal. I am a criminal. I tell myself I have no choice, but this is cowardice speaking. I have a choice. I could refuse. I could accept the consequences of refusal. Instead, I continue to obey, and people die because of my obedience. Klaus fought through 1943 and into 1944 as the Wehrmacht slowly retreated across Eastern Europe. The Soviet offensives grew stronger. German lines collapsed. Entire army groups were encircled and destroyed. Klaus witnessed the disintegration of the force that had seemed invincible in 1941. He continued adding pages to the letter. Each entry documented another step in the moral catastrophe he was living through. He wrote about the scorched earth policies, the destruction of villages to deny them to advancing Soviet forces. He wrote about the columns of refugees fleeing west, German civilians trying to escape Soviet vengeance. He wrote about the wounded left behind because there were no vehicles to evacuate them. By June 1944, the letter had grown to 43 pages. Klaus kept them folded inside his uniform. They were his confession, his testimony, his attempt to maintain some thread of moral awareness in circumstances designed to destroy morality. He knew the letter could not save anyone, could not change anything, could not undo what he had done. But writing it was the only act of resistance he could manage. On July 20, 1944, Klaus heard about the assassination attempt on Hitler. Officers had tried to kill the Führer with a bomb at his military headquarters. The attempt failed. Klaus felt a complex mixture of hope and despair. Hope that others were resisting, that he was not alone in his doubts. Despair that the attempt had failed, that the war would continue, that more people would die. The aftermath of the failed assassination was brutal. The SS arrested thousands. Anyone suspected of involvement was tortured and executed. Their families were sent to concentration camps. The repression was so thorough that Klaus understood any thought of resistance was suicide. He was a coward. He would remain a coward. He would follow orders until the war ended or until he died. In August 1944, Klaus's regiment was transferred to Poland as part of the desperate attempt to stop the Soviet summer offensive. The Red Army was advancing on multiple fronts simultaneously. German forces were outnumbered and outgunned. Retreats became routes. Order broke down. Soldiers deserted. Officers shot deserters. The Wehrmacht was dying. Klaus wrote in the letter, "We are losing not because we were unlucky or because the enemy was stronger. We are losing because we deserve to lose. A nation that wages aggressive war, that murders civilians as policy, that builds an ideology on racial hatred, such a nation should lose. Must lose. I am grateful we are losing, even though our defeat means my death is likely. Better that Germany loses and this horror ends than that we continue to win and spread this horror further. In January 1945, Klaus's regiment was encircled during the Soviet Vistula Oder offensive. The pocket formed rapidly as Soviet tank formations cut through German lines. Klaus and 3,000 other soldiers found themselves trapped near the town of Lodz. They held defensive positions for 6 days. Soviet artillery pulverized their positions. Soviet infantry attacked repeatedly. Ammunition ran low. Food ran out. On January 23, the senior officer ordered surrender. Klaus destroyed his rifle before the Soviets arrived. He tore his Iron Cross from his uniform and buried it in the snow. He kept the letter. He transferred it from his uniform pocket to a waterproof pouch he had carried since 1942. When the Soviets marched them into captivity, Klaus carried 43 pages of confession with him. Soviet captivity was harsh but not brutal, not in the systematic way Klaus had experienced German brutality. The Soviets put captured German soldiers to work rebuilding what the Wehrmacht had destroyed. Klaus spent 2 years in a labor camp near Minsk. He worked on construction projects, cleared rubble from destroyed buildings, repaired roads. The work was exhausting. The rations were minimal. Many prisoners died from disease and malnutrition. But there were no mass executions. No collective punishments. The Soviets treated their prisoners the way one would expect victors to treat defeated enemies, harshly but not murderously. Klaus wrote the final entry in the letter on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. The war is over. We have lost as we should have lost. Now comes the reckoning. I do not know if I will survive to face judgment for what I have done. If I do survive, I will not lie about my actions. I will not claim I was merely following orders. I will accept responsibility for my choices. This letter is my testimony. I wrote it so that if I die before I can speak, there will be a record. Someone should know what we did. Someone should understand that ordinary men who loved literature and wanted to teach, men who believed in duty and honor, such men can become participants in great evil if they do not have the courage to resist. Klaus survived the labor camp. He was released in 1947 and allowed to return to Germany. He made his way back to Munich on foot, traveling for 6 weeks through destroyed cities and displaced populations. He arrived at his family's apartment in November 1947. His mother had died in 1945 during an air raid. His father was still alive, working at the same postal administration office, maintaining the same routine in a city that had been reduced to rubble. Klaus and Heinrich sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Klaus pulled out the waterproof pouch. He removed the letter, now 57 pages, stained and worn from years of carrying. I wrote this for you, Klaus said. But I could never send it. I'm giving it to you now. Read it or don't read it. I needed you to know it exists. Heinrich took the pages, looked at his son, said, I know what you saw. I know what you did. You do not need to explain. Klaus shook his head. I do need to explain. To you. To myself. To anyone who will listen. If we do not speak about what happened, if we pretend it was all someone else's fault, we will learn nothing. We will do it again. Heinrich did not read the letter that day. He placed it in a drawer in his desk and left it there for years. But Klaus began speaking. He gave testimony at trials. He spoke to journalists who were documenting the war. He returned to teaching, but now he taught history with a different focus. He taught about the dangers of nationalism, the ease with which ordinary people can be led to commit extraordinary crimes, the absolute necessity of moral courage. In 1963, Heinrich Hartmann died. Klaus found the letter in his father's desk, still in its envelope, still sealed except where Klaus had originally opened it. Tucked inside was a note in Heinrich's handwriting. I read this once. I could not read it again. But I kept it because you were right. Someone should know. I am proud of you for having the courage to write it, and ashamed that I never had the courage to ask you about it. Klaus donated the letter to the Munich Institute for Contemporary History in 1971. The institute preserved it as part of its collection of primary documents from the Second World War. Historians studied it as an example of how individual Germans experienced and understood the war. Scholars cited it in works about moral responsibility and the psychology of compliance with criminal orders. The letter was published in full in 1985 in a collection of German soldiers' testimonies. It was translated into 7 languages. Students read it in schools across Germany. It became part of the national conversation about guilt, responsibility, and memory. Klaus Hartmann lived until 1994. He died at age 76 in the same Munich apartment where he had written the first pages of the letter 52 years earlier. His obituary in the Süddeutsche Zeitung described him as an educator and moral witness, a man who refused to forget what he had done during the war and who spent his life ensuring others would not forget either. The letter itself remains in the Munich Institute for Contemporary History archives. Researchers request access to it regularly. It is one of the most frequently cited documents in studies of Wehrmacht crimes and individual moral responsibility during the war. The original pages, now fragile and yellowed, are protected in acid-free sleeves. Photographs of the pages are available for public viewing. But the power of the letter is not in its historical value. The power is in its honesty. Klaus Hartmann did not write it to excuse himself or to claim he was different from other soldiers. He wrote it to document his own complicity, to create a record of how an educated man who loved literature and believed in duty could participate in systematic violence against innocent people. He wrote, "I want whoever reads this to understand that I was not a monster. I was an ordinary man who made terrible choices. I told myself I had no choice, but this was a lie. I always had a choice. I chose to obey rather than to resist because resistance required courage I did not possess. This is not an excuse. It is an explanation. And the explanation is that evil does not require monsters. It requires only ordinary people who lack the courage to say no." 63 years after Klaus Hartmann first sat down to write a letter he could never send, scholars still debate its significance. Some argue it demonstrates that not all Germans were willing participants in Nazi crimes, that many experienced moral doubt and internal conflict. Others argue it demonstrates the opposite, that even those who understood what they were doing continued to participate, making their guilt even greater. Klaus himself addressed this debate in a lecture he gave in 1988 to history students at Ludwig Maximilian University, the same university where he had studied before the war. A student asked him whether writing the letter was an act of resistance. Klaus was 70 years old then, white-haired and frail, his voice still carrying the measured cadence of a teacher. "No," he said. "Writing the letter was not resistance. It was cowardice disguised as conscience. Real resistance would have been refusing orders and accepting the consequences. Real resistance would have been helping the people I was ordered to harm. Real resistance would have required courage. I did not have that courage. So I wrote words on paper and told myself that documenting my guilt was somehow meaningful. It was not. The letter changed nothing. The only value it has now is as evidence, as testimony that can help others understand how ordinary people become complicit in evil. If it does that, if it helps even one person choose courage over compliance, then perhaps the cowardice that produced it will have served some small purpose." The student pressed further. "But didn't writing the letter require its own kind of courage? You could have been caught with it. You could have been executed." Klaus smiled, a sad smile that held decades of accumulated understanding. "The letter was safe because I never intended to share it during the war. It was a private confession written for myself more than for anyone else. Carrying it was no more dangerous than carrying a photograph of home. The real courage, the courage I lacked, would have been acting on what I knew rather than simply writing about it." Another student asked, "What would you say to young Germans today? How can we ensure we would not make the same choices you made?" Klaus thought for a moment. Then he said, "I would say that you already face these choices, every day in smaller ways. Every time you witness injustice and remain silent, you are making a choice. Every time you comply with rules you know are wrong because compliance is easier than resistance, you are training yourself for greater complicity. Evil does not announce itself. It arrives gradually, in small compromises, in reasonable-sounding justifications, in the comfort of going along with what everyone else is doing. The only defense is to practice courage in small things so that you will have courage for large things when they arrive." The letter that was never sent became a sent message after all, not to Klaus's father as originally intended, but to generations of people who would read it and understand something about the nature of moral responsibility, the psychology of compliance, and the terrible ease with which ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil. The archival photographs of Klaus Hartmann from the war show a young man in Wehrmacht uniform, thin-faced and serious, eyes that seem to be looking at something beyond the camera. Later photographs, from his teaching years, show an older man with gentle features, still serious, but with a different quality to his seriousness. Not the grim determination of a soldier but the careful gravity of someone who has learned expensive lessons and wants others to learn them more cheaply. In 2008, a German television documentary team interviewed several of Klaus's former students, now elderly themselves. They remembered him as demanding but fair, passionate about history, insistent on primary sources and careful analysis. Several mentioned that he never discussed his own war service in class except in the most general terms. He taught the facts of the war, the timeline of battles and political decisions, but he did not insert himself into the narrative. Only later, when students read his letter in the archives or saw it published, did they understand what their teacher had experienced and what he had chosen to carry with him. One former student, now a retired judge, said in the documentary, "Herr Hartmann taught us that understanding history is not about memorizing dates or celebrating victories. It's about understanding how human beings make choices under pressure, and how those choices create consequences that ripple forward in time. He taught us to question narratives, to seek evidence, to be skeptical of simple explanations. But most importantly, he taught us, through his own example, that moral courage is not about being fearless. It's about being afraid and acting anyway. He was afraid during the war. He made choices he regretted. But he had the courage to face those choices, to speak honestly about them, and to spend his life helping others learn from his failures. That is the kind of courage that matters most. The letter itself, in its final form, contains observations that remain relevant beyond its specific historical context. Klaus wrote about the human capacity for self-deception, the ease with which people can convince themselves that wrong actions are necessary or justified. He wrote about the power of propaganda to shape perception, to make the abnormal seem normal, to transform cruelty into duty. He wrote about the loneliness of moral doubt in environments where such doubt is dangerous, where questioning orders or expressing uncertainty can be interpreted as disloyalty. These observations speak to universal human tendencies, not specific to Nazi Germany or the Second World War. This is why the letter continues to be studied and cited in contemporary contexts, why it appears in discussions about military ethics, corporate responsibility, political complicity, and individual moral agency. Klaus Hartmann's testimony about his own failures provides insight into how failures happen, how good intentions become corrupted, how ordinary people end up participating in systems they know are wrong. The last entry in the letter, written in May 1945 in the Soviet labor camp, contains Klaus's final reflection. I survived a war in which millions died. I do not know why I survived when so many others better than I did not. Perhaps there is no reason. Perhaps survival is only luck and nothing more. But having survived, I have a responsibility to speak the truth about what I saw and what I did. Not to absolve myself. Guilt is not something that can be washed away by confession. But to ensure that my experience, terrible as it was, serves some purpose other than adding to the sum of human suffering. If this letter helps even one person understand how easily ordinary people can participate in evil, if it helps even one person choose resistance over compliance when faced with criminal orders, then the years I spent carrying it, the risk I took in preserving it, will have been worthwhile. That paragraph encapsulates the letter's power and its purpose. It is not a justification or an excuse. It is a testimony. An honest accounting by a man who understood his own failures and chose to document them so that others might learn. The Munich Institute for Contemporary History receives regular requests from scholars, journalists, educators, and ordinary citizens who want to read Klaus Hartmann's letter. The institute provides access under carefully controlled conditions. Researchers must wear gloves when handling the original documents. Photography is permitted only with special permission. But the content is freely available in published form and in digital archives. Every year on the anniversary of Klaus's death, the institute holds a small ceremony. A historian reads selections from the letter. Students from local schools attend. The ceremony is quiet, solemn, focused on remembrance and education rather than mourning. Klaus himself requested in his will that there be no religious service, no grand memorial, just a simple recognition that he had existed, that he had participated in terrible events, and that he had tried, imperfectly, to bear witness to what he had experienced. The letter that was never sent reaches more people now than any letter Klaus could have mailed in 1942. It sits in archives and libraries. It appears in textbooks. Students read it in history classes and ethics courses. It has been included in museum exhibitions about the Holocaust and Wehrmacht crimes. It has been cited in trials of war criminals and in discussions of international law. And in Munich, in the small apartment on Luisenstrasse where Klaus first sat down to write words he could not send, there is now a plaque on the wall. The plaque reads, "Here lived Klaus Hartmann, 1918 to 1994, teacher and moral witness. He served in the Wehrmacht during World War II, participated in crimes he came to recognize as evil, and spent his life after the war documenting his complicity and teaching others about the necessity of moral courage. His testimony reminds us that we are all responsible for our choices, and that the most important choice is the courage to resist when resistance is needed most." The letter itself, 57 pages of careful handwriting, confession, observation, and analysis, remains the most complete record of how one ordinary German experienced the war, understood what he was participating in, and struggled unsuccessfully to find the courage to stop. It is not a comfortable document to read. It does not provide easy answers or moral clarity. But it provides something more valuable, honesty about how difficult moral clarity can be, about how easily we can compromise our principles, about how much courage is required to resist when resistance comes at personal cost. Klaus Hartmann never claimed to be a hero. He rejected that label explicitly whenever it was offered. He insisted he was a coward who had written words instead of taking action. But the act of writing those words, of preserving them through years of war and captivity, of sharing them publicly despite the shame they documented, that act required its own kind of courage. Not the courage he wished he had possessed during the war, not the courage to resist criminal orders. But the courage to face his own failures honestly, to refuse the comfort of self-deception, to spend his life teaching others about the choices he regretted. In the end, the letter was never sent as originally intended. Heinrich Hartmann never received it from his son during the war. But the letter found its recipients anyway. Millions of them. Every person who has read it and understood something about the nature of complicity, about the psychology of obedience, about the absolute necessity of moral courage in the face of injustice? They are the recipients Klaus never imagined when he first put pen to paper on that December morning in 1942. The letter that was never sent became a message that could not be silenced. And Klaus Hartmann, the ordinary man who wrote it, became a witness whose testimony endures, uncomfortable and honest, a reminder that evil requires our participation, and that resistance, however difficult, however costly, is always possible.